Okay.
Hello and welcome to this special Glen Iris City Council conversation about Labassa and its intriguing and often surprising history. My name is Alicia Cerreto. I'm a historian who works with community groups and students of all ages. To begin this event, I'd like to acknowledge the Bunurong and Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation as traditional owners and custodians of the land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and honour the role that First Peoples have played in preserving and sharing their history over thousands of years. I am coming to you from Bunurong country and I want to acknowledge all the lands that our audience is coming from today too. Now, Labassa is an enduring and familiar site in the Caulfield landscape. It has survived 9 owners, a conversion into flats, and over 700 residents during its near 160-year history. This discussion will take us on a journey through Labassa's rise, decline, and 11th hour rescue by the National Trust. You will also hear more about Labassa's famous and infamous residents, including silent film stars, fraudsters, millionaires, artists, and bohemians. There really is something for everyone in these stories. And you'll be able to ask questions along the way in the comments or chat section, and I'll put them to Vicki on your behalf. And of course, that leads me to our special guest, Vicki Shuttleworth. I'm thrilled that we have Vicki with us here to share the story of Labassa. Vicki is responsible for the beautiful book that you see on your screen, and she has spent many years committed to discovering these stories and sharing them with us all. Welcome, Vicki.
Thank you, Alicia. Good morning.
And so we'll wait for questions to come in, and we'll have question time at the end. But also, if you've got any questions through the event, we really welcome you to pop them in the comments section and they'll come through to me here. So, Vicki, can you tell us the stories of the very early days of Labassa up until, say, about 1920?
Yes, well, as you mentioned, Labassa is built on the land of the Bunurong people who were driven from the land during the 1850s. And the first house on the land was actually very modest. It was only 8 rooms, 4 rooms downstairs, 4 rooms upstairs. And it was built for Richard Ainsley Billing, who was a barrister, an Irish barrister who came across from Ireland with his wife Mary around about 1856. And the house was completed around about 1863. After about 10 years, when he was well established and built up his practice, he wanted a much grander house. And so the house was extended from 8 rooms to 20 rooms. And those 2 houses, if you like, are still within the walls of Labassa itself. So after Mr. Billing died, the house was eventually bought by Alexander Robertson, who was one of the wealthiest men in Australia. Some people say he was the second wealthiest in Australia. He was an owner, co-owner in Cobb & Co coach lines. He had very large pastoral estates in New South Wales and Queensland. And he wanted the grandest house in Melbourne because he was very socially ambitious, Canadian in origin, but he was very ambitious for his sons and daughters. His sons went to the best schools in England. His daughters went to Oberwell first, but then later to finishing school in Europe. And he particularly wanted his daughters to marry into British aristocracy, which didn't exactly happen, but these were his ambitions. So he wanted the grandest house so he could show off his wealth and his good taste. And he employed an architect called John Koch, who was a local architect, although he was born in Germany. And he was given the brief to extend the house from 20 rooms to 35 and to carry out a very elaborate redecoration of the exterior and interior. So the house as you see it today, on the cover of the book or anywhere, is very much Mr. Robertson's house. This was his little palace, if you like. After he died, his estate wasn't wound up for a considerable time, and it wasn't until 1904 that the Watsons came on the scene and bought the house. And they lived there from about 1905 to 1919, and most significantly, they gave the house its name, Labassa, which a lot of people think is after some sort of European palace, but it's actually from a Fijian village. They did a tour of the Pacific Islands at the turn of the century and fell in love with the place, and so they named their house Labassa. So when they sold the house, eventually, it was sold to a real estate agent, which could have been very bad news, but he actually appreciated the house. And when he converted it into flats, he didn't do much damage to the house itself, its interiors or exteriors. We were very fortunate. So that's a very basic outline of the early years.
The early years, yes. And we saw that very striking image on the front of the book itself. And I'll share again to show some more pictures, because my next question is about the architecture. And I know in particular that we have a lot of visitors coming to Labassa who really love architecture and are really drawn to this unusual house. Or what is unusual now. And I'm going to show everybody some photographs of some different features and let you take us through those aspects. So here we have another exterior shot.
Yes.
And what should we observe in this beautiful pink and grey building? I saw someone describe it as a galah.
Yes, and other people have described it as a wedding cake. So take your choice. But you're right in observing its pinkness. And so it does have marble inserts. Some of them are real and some of them are simulated, but it does beautifully set off the grey of the building. And you'll notice that it's very ornate. You know, it's got a profusion of classical features such as masks of Hera and Zeus, Aphrodite's around the other side. It's also got acanthus leaves and griffins, a whole host of natural life. And where you can see the main entrance, you'll see two figures of females. These are also classical, they're known as caryatids. And above the bay window, you'll notice what appears to be a family crest. There are two figures there, a male and a female, not necessarily easy to see from the ground level, but that's actually a fake. I did some research on the crest and it doesn't actually exist. I couldn't find any equivalent anywhere, but it's there as part of the grandeur of the house and to give the impression that this family is very well connected, I think. There are a couple of Scottish thistles just below it. So that's probably an allusion to Mr. Robertson's family heritage, because his parents came from Scotland across to Ontario where he was born.
Okay, so quite a sort of typical motif to recognise the Scottish background.
Yes.
So this is another picture of the exterior and the garden surrounding it as well.
Well, this shows the full extent of the house. It's a wonderful photo by photographer John Rendell, who took many of the photos for the book. And you can see more clearly here the arcade, the veranda and the balcony and the Corinthian columns and a little bit of the garden. Unfortunately, Labassa lost most of its garden progressively during the last century.
So we're going to let everyone get inside. And so this extraordinary image as well, was this specially taken for the book, this photograph?
Yes, it was. That's another John Rindell photo. It's what you call a trompe-l'oeil. It's intended to trick the eye into seeing up through the balustrade to the sky. It's hand-painted, but the remarkable thing is that people didn't know it was there for most of the 60s and 70s because it was hidden. And what happened in around about 1962, a part of the ceiling collapsed late at night, woke everybody up in the house with a thunderous noise. And so the owners in those days didn't, restore painted ceilings, so they just covered it over. And it was only rediscovered when the National Trust conservators were working on the frieze and found this marvellous ceiling under it. And of course, it was then restored.
Oh, how extraordinary. Yes, it's a real showstopper, this one. And now, where are we now? This is the main hallway?
Yes, this is the main hallway at Labassa, and I think one of the most significant things about this hallway is how it survived intact, virtually intact, because when you think about 700 people or more living in the house and the hundreds of people who have visited and the parties, etc., and the number of animals that also lived in the house, cats and dogs and a duck, it's just amazing that it survived. The hand-painted ceiling is in really good condition. It's only been lightly cleaned. The wallpaper, which is Japanese manufactured, has been cleaned. It's a wonderful example of 19th century wallpaper. It's an acanthus design, and it also features pomegranates and little butterflies, which you can check out next time you're at the house. They're not that easy to see, but they're a great surprise. And the lights are original to the house. One of them disappeared at one point in mid-century. One of the tenants took it with them, but it was returned after the National Trust bought the property, as were many other items.
And I know we'll talk a little bit about it later on, but the preservation and the conservation that happened once the National Trust took responsibility for the place just shows how much work must have been done to get it to this state that we're seeing today. And our last interior photo, I believe this is the drawing room, or what's called the drawing room.
Yes, it's also called the wow room because when people come to the house for the first time and they walk in, they go, wow. Yeah. It's French Rococo in style. This was Mr. Robertson's main reception room. There are descriptions of it in 19th century newspapers. And you'll see on the right a very ornate fireplace, hand-carved Rococo in style. And if you look at the two pillars framing the southern end of the room, those pillars or columns are where the original window of the 1862 house was. That was where the window was. So it gives you an idea of, the kind of extensions that happened to the house. It's very popular with filmmakers and with wedding photography, fashion photography, and those who watch Miss Fisher's murder mysteries. Several episodes were filmed at Labassa, and this room features in one or two of them.
Oh, of course. Well, I can imagine why it would be so appealing to people, and sort of really capturing those early days that you've told us about, of that idea of a mansion going to a real sort of palace style of home. So lots of people in the audience are locals or might be familiar with Caulfield itself. And we left off our history of Labassa at around 1920. So how did the evolution of Labassa echo the development of the area of Caulfield itself?
Well, there were other houses going through a similar history to Labassa. As I mentioned earlier, Labassa was converted into flats in 1920, but there are other houses that went through this. For example, Maysbury and Maysbury Avenue, that was a family home that was converted into flats and then later became apartments. But Labassa has survived. Many of the houses around Caulfield didn't survive that era because the land was just far too valuable. And so right through the 20s and 30s, many of these houses were demolished and they're only known by street names around the area. So around Labassa, there are streets such as Testar or Chattersley or St Albans, and these are streets where there were once major villas or mansions in the area. Labassa survived because from 1920 through to 1946, all the people who bought the house as an investment also lived there. They lived alongside their tenants. And of course, it's their home, they look after it. This wasn't always the case around Caulfield, but most of the tenants in these properties looked after it, because the houses were in good condition. After that, there were people who didn't live there and who are mainly investors. And this is one of the problems with houses of this generation, both at Labassa and in the surrounding area, that people have to make money from their investment. So they can't afford to put a lot of money into maintaining a building. So you see the decline around Labassa, of houses around Labassa and Labassa itself during that period. Demographically, Labassa is also very much a part of Caulfield's story. So you have the colonials first, right through to the hippies who moved into the area later in the century, in the 20th century. But right up to the First World War, of course, we had mainly people of British heritage. And of course, the White Australia policy ensured that there weren't too many people coming into Australia from Europe and Asia. So it was mainly British settlers who lived in Labassa and in the surrounding area. Post-war, there was the post-war migration boom, and that's where we see a change in the demographics in the area. We have many Jewish refugees arriving into the Caulfield area. During the 1950s at Labassa, the entire first floor was occupied by Jewish Holocaust survivors. And then we had a second wave of migration. We had the people who came from Eastern Europe and Scandinavia who were coming for economic reasons. They wanted a better life for their children. These families obviously had children eventually, and we had the baby boom, and then we have the baby boomers moving into Labassa and the Caulfield area because they're going to Monash University, they're going to Caulfield and Paran Institutes. And Labassa ends up in the 60s and 70s with a very young population of students, and not to be overlooked, people from the ABC Rip and Lee studios, lots of creatives, editors, etc., who had moved close to their work. So there is a very strong connection between the history of Caulfield and Labassa itself, as you would expect.
Yes, I was really taken by that idea of the migrants coming in and changing the face, both of, the suburb and broader, really, of course, but also what was happening at Labassa. And then as we moved into the 60s and 70s, the people got younger as well, I think.
Yes, yeah. And some of them were in their late teens, early 20s. So it must have been an amazing house during that period to be with so many young people. I think one of the tenants, the last tenant from the earlier generation, moved out in 1970, and then there were only the Helfords left, an elderly couple upstairs, who put up with a lot in the house. But, you know, while parties, they did write occasional letters to the agent complaining about the noise and various activities in the house. But they were very fondly remembered by the young people who lived there as well.
Yes, you do outline a little bit about the parties in the house and what that looked like. But even, you know, in those early years as well, with children hosting, you know, well, adult or older, young adult children hosting parties, their parents hosting parties, and then we sort of see that map through in the 20th century as well. So I've heard the word survivor a lot, and I'm sort of thinking so much of this house surviving, you know, and thinking about what was the threat to Labassa over the years. And then as a second part, how did the National Trust get involved?
Well, there were two main threats to the house. I don't want to oversimplify it, but the main threat was the value of the land. I mean, the land was far more valuable than the house. And so at any point, the wrong person could have bought the house and demolished it and then subdivided the land. And as I mentioned, early on, the owners actually lived there, so it survived one of the peak periods of the demolition. The second danger to the house was maintenance. It's very expensive to maintain houses of 35 rooms, and you have to keep it watertight. It's very hard to keep these houses with a massive roof and guttering. You have to spend quite a bit of money on maintaining the roof and the guttering, otherwise water gets in. And water did get into Labassa, particularly from the Second World War onwards. And so during the 1960s, there are stories of water running down the walls around the staircase. It used to just stream down the walls. So also the other threat within the house was fireplaces and the flues. And in the 50s, people used to complain about the amount of smoke in the house because people were still using fireplaces then. Later they were banned. But there were at least two instances where fires broke out in the fireplace and the fire brigade had to be called. And there's evidence of another fire in another fireplace. I don't know the story with that one, but it's very obvious that something happened. So those were the two dangers. The National Trust became very actively involved in the early 70s. But before that, there were a number of key architects who took an interest in the property. One of them was Robin Boyd, who came to the house in the 1940s and took photos and included Labassa in his book. And later, he made a film with the ABC at Labassa, 1957-1958, because he regarded the property as of significance as part of marvellous Melbourne. And of course, he was very instrumental in the foundation of the National Trust itself in the 50s. So the National Trust became actively involved in June 1974, when it classified the house as of state significance. And that was followed a few months later by Labassa being included on the first Victorian Register of Historic Houses. And the aim was to protect houses, these were private houses, from demolition. But of course, you can't really control what an owner does within the walls of their property or their tenants. And also, there's always still the risk that a developer could buy the property and then at midnight sneak in and do a partial demolition and then sit it out, wait for the local council to give in, or the Heritage Council, whatever the equivalent would be, and then get permission to demolish the house. So it was only in 1980, when the last owner, private owner of Labassa, died, Mrs. Kaiser, that the trust had an opportunity to buy the property. And it went to auction. It was a competitive auction. There were two other serious bidders there. One wanted it as a restaurant and the other wanted it for a private home. But Labassa the National Trust made the winning bid, $282,500, which doesn't sound a lot of money today, but it was a substantial amount. And yes, so they were able to do that with the help of Alcoa Australia. And they purchased the house and commenced conservation work on the house. And finally were able to buy a house at the front, which we haven't mentioned yet, Alicia.
No, we haven't yet.
And I think you might have a photo somewhere of that.
All right, if you're ready for it, here it comes. So this is the cream brick house that was built by the Kaisers.
Correct.
That's right?
Yeah. So what happened, the Kaisers sold off some of the land. To the west, a block of flats was built, and then they built their own home in the front garden, and you can see how close it is to the house. They got permission from the council to do this. I don't think the council would permit that kind of build in the area anymore. But anyway, when Mr. Kaiser passed away, Mrs. Kaiser sold that house on a separate title. It wasn't part of Labassa. So the National Trust actually had to buy that house back and then demolish it. And it was demolished by Wheel and the Wrecker, as you can see, which a lot of people commented on as being very ironic, because Wheel and the Wrecker was the wrecker of choice in Melbourne for much of the 20th century in demolishing a lot of these historic houses. They did it as a donation to the Trust.
It's definitely a striking image, and I thought also there was an image in the book where it showed the view from the large Labassa house looking onto the fence behind this one, and what that meant for the residents at the time.
I'm not sure which photo you're referring to.
Oh, well, just how close those two buildings were, and yeah, just sort of how much it must have changed the space, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I know the one you're talking about. It's a shot of the back fence of this house and the front of the house, and people walking between the two. And there's barely enough room for two people to walk side by side.
Now, we've had a couple of questions come in from our audience, and one of them is, do you know how much land Labassa was built on originally?
Depending on what language you speak, it's either originally 12 acres or 5 hectares, I think. And then it was extended by Mr. Robertson, and it became 5 hectares. Because he wanted to run horses on the property.
And then we sort of, you trace that in the book really beautifully. I think the way that different owners have had to sort of subdivide certain sections, or, have either had to do that because of financial reasons, or just as their lives evolved, they changed it, and it's gradually sort of shrunken in, I suppose.
Yes, but I mean, that's one of the reasons I believe Labassa survived. The bad news ended up being good news. So to the west, you've got a block of units. Then you had this double-storey house in the front, and around the side you have the Willis flats, which were built by one of the owners. So the house is kind of cocooned, and anybody who wanted to develop that lot would have to buy a couple of properties and then demolish them. You know, it would have been a very expensive proposition for a developer looking to work on that plot of land.
Yes, and I think, you know, just as much as there were sort of moments, some of it was really luck, wasn't it? That, you know, a certain owner, a certain neighbour, choices that were made.
Yeah, I think a lot of people really appreciated the house, its grandeur. So even the real estate agent, he developed other mansions and he lived in them for a while. He did actually appreciate them. Not all real estate agents and developers did that. And for two of the owners from the 20s and 30s, it was their retirement home. And they'd finally made it. They were living in a little palace and they enjoyed it. So I think that's a very big part of the story, people actually appreciating the house. And of course, the young people who lived there in the 60s and 70s, many of them artists, also appreciated the house and they looked after it.
Yeah. Well, we're lucky to still have it now in 2021. And there's a question here, how many people lived at Labassa at the busiest time? I know that it's sometimes hard to tell how many people were in the house at any one time.
Very, very hard to answer that question. This is a guesstimate. Let's say it's mid-70s. At any point there could be 35 people living in the house, but a lot more, because upstairs, at one stage, I think there were about 15 people living in one flat because they used to share. And some people even set up beds in the hallway and put a little curtain around. And in the smoking lounge, one person built a mezzanine level against the wall so they could put in another bed. And there was a lot of bed sharing that went on, you know, not necessarily to do with sexual relationships, but they just used to share beds. You know, you could have 4 or 5 people in one room. So very difficult to estimate.
Yes. Well, let's have a look at some specific people. There's some questions here asking about infamous stories or dramas, but how about we share some of these photos. Here we have 2 quite famous residents from early on. Can you tell us about these 2 women?
Yes, well, probably the most famous is Louise Lovely on the right, because she was arguably Australia's most successful Hollywood actress during the silent era. She made over 50 films in Hollywood. When she came to Labassa around about 1936 and lived in the Willis flats, she was still a celebrity, even though her star had faded a little bit. She was still acting on the stage. On the right is Rosamond Love, part of a very glamorous family. Rosamond's aunt was Dorothy Hammerstein. Her uncle, by marriage, was Oscar Hammerstein II, the famous lyricist, who wrote for Oklahoma, Sound of Music, King and I, etc. And Rosamond used to go to America and stay with the Rellies. And she had a very glamorous life. She even looked a little bit like Jean Harlow.
Yes, she does, doesn't she? So that would have perhaps been part of like what was attractive to people about Labassa as well at that time, perhaps.
That's a maybe, because when they lived at the house, it was a very settled house. There'd been genteel couples, you know, who wouldn't have necessarily been attracted to the house for them. They came into that environment.
I'll I'll move to our next picture here. This is the famous Boris.
Yes, the famous Boris. So many stories about Boris. He has a bit of a mystique, as you can see, and the photographer has captured that beautifully. He was also known as Rasputin. There are lots of stories about him being involved with the bikies and certain connections with the drug industry. And I actually caught up with him after the book was published. A couple of people came forward, some friends came forward, and some people who weren't so friendly. And I was able to find him, and we exchanged a few emails, and he was able to set the record straight on a few things. For example, one of his famous top hats and his costumes were actually from his involvement with the Village Roadshow. They were props. But there are also lots of other stories I wasn't able to get to the bottom of because I really didn't want to broach some of the more sensitive issues that were raised.
Yes, I want to ask you a little bit about making the book and putting the book together and researching it, but we'll do that a little bit later on. Let me share our next picture, which is Jane Clifton.
There's Jane in her flat, and she came to Labassa in 1971. She tried to get in before. She fell in love with the place when she went to a party one night, and she tried to get a flat much earlier than 1971. She was studying at Monash University at the time, and she was also performing with an avant-garde troupe called Tribe, and they were performing at La Mama and Pram Factory, and they used to rehearse in the grounds of Labassa, and eventually other members of Tribe moved into the house. It was very much an artist hub in the 1970s.
Yes, and I think if any of our audience are curious, they can do a bit of a Google and you'll find there's some radio interviews where Jane talks about living in the house as well, which is great. Now, next photograph is of John Harland, who's responsible, in fact, for quite a lot of these photos from that era.
Yes, his hobby was photography. He wasn't a professional photographer, but he used to go around and take photos of many of the residents, beautiful photos that show them in situ, which is missing from earlier photos of people in the house because, you know, people just had basic box brownies. They didn't have flash photography, and film was very expensive. And he took some wonderful photos of the people who lived there, well over 320 photos of the people.
Yes, we're lucky to sort of have that period of time documented by John, and they are really striking images. Now, one of our audience members wants to know, are there any friendly ghosts inhabiting the house?
This is always a tricky question because I have been to the house day and night on my own and I've never felt a presence. Some people would say that they have. I like to say that the house has a presence. A stronger presence than perhaps the people who live there. But it's really understandable that people would believe that it's haunted, and because it does have a Gothic presence, particularly at night upstairs. And during the 70s, when the lights weren't working, you know, you'd look at the stained glass window and it's just all black and white and shadowy. And some people did get freaked out at night, although I suspect some of them might have been imbibing a few things and susceptible to getting creeped out.
Oh, well, so it sounds like people will have to visit to find out for themselves. And are there any, there's a question here about infamous stories or dramas that happened in the house that you want to tell us about?
Well, there was a party in 1969. It becomes infamous because that was the night that one of the precious Newell post lamps at the base of the stairs was ripped out. And it was a night when there were hundreds of people there. There were hundreds of people in the house, on the roof and in the street. The Hells Angels were there, and the police turned up, and it was just wild, wild. And I'd been told that the Newell lamp was stolen by the Hells Angels. Others said it was a tenant, and other people just said it was a visitor. So we have these conflicting stories. Eventually, a man came forward who had actually been there, who had chased the culprit and caught him and got a good look at him. And it wasn't Hells Angels, and it wasn't a resident.
Okay, so does that remain a mystery then? What happened?
Yes, well, after the lamp was found, it just disappeared. And we don't really know what happened to it.
And that was a question one of our audience members wanted to know. They said, you know, were they replaced then now as reproductions? Is that what we see when we visit Labassa?
Yes, those are reproductions paid for by the Friends of Labassa.
And our final picture of some of the inhabitants, this is around 1970, I think?
Yes, it's a photo taken by Peter Tarpy, who was studying photography at Perantec, and the assignment was take a photo of your family. And so Labassa was his family, and as you can see, it's a very young household, several artists and students, and Peter himself, I think, is in the foreground with holding the dog. It's a wonderful photo. There is another photo that he took on the stairs, but it's just a wonderful picture of what the household was like around about 1970.
I love that too, that notion of, you know, expanding the notion of family and talking about, you know, your chosen family and those who you live with. So I think that's a great example. And there's another question that comes through before we move into a little bit more about how you wrote this book, where someone's asking, can you tell us a bit more about the weeping or crying room?
I have never heard of the weeping or crying room.
Okay, well, if anyone wants to add some detail in the comments section, please do. And if you have any questions for Vicki, please go ahead and put them in now. We've got about 15-ish minutes more to chat together. So can you tell us a little bit about the project of writing the book, how you tracked people down, how did you piece together this story?
We've had two returns to Labassa, and so I've been able to gather a lot of information directly from people who lived there, who visited, who owned the property, and who gave me lots of leads, you know, names of people and stories. So that was absolutely invaluable. Apart from that, I rely on a lot of the devices, strategies that family historians use, such as electoral rolls and directories. I used, which a lot of people wouldn't use necessarily, divorce records, because in the first half of the previous century, divorce records were very detailed. People gave full accounts of their life, dates, places, and with one divorce that happened at Labassa, you even got a sense of the geography of the house, where people actually lived, who they knew, a bit about their neighbours, etc. I also used wills, because wills often provide details of family relationships, and also the names of people that may sometimes be different from what they appear as in the electoral roll. So for many years, I had this person called Boris, and I couldn't work out who Doris was, but it turned out that I actually already knew her, and she was Agnes. She was Agnes on the roll and Dot to everyone else.
Yes, that's so often a trap for historians or for anyone researching a history, is the different names that people are known by.
Mm.
And as with any history, you must have come up against some challenges. How did you manage, things like issues or sensitivities?
Yes, well, when you're researching a building, you're essentially researching people as well. And some people are very happy to know about scandals and family secrets, particularly if the relative is way in the past. It's a good yarn. But if it happens to be their grandfather, it can be very tricky. So, for example, one descendant told me that grandma and grandpa got a divorce. And divorce is an important theme at Labassa because there were many divorced women living there in the 1930s. And they told me that grandpa liked to flirt with the ladies, and grandma got sick of him carrying on like that, so she went for a divorce. And it was told in a very light-hearted, anecdotal way. But when I went to look at the divorce records, which the descendant knew I was doing, I found a very different story. It was a story about family violence, of mental illness, and even an attempted family extinction. So, the dilemma is, do I tell the family member, or do I have a right to withhold that information? So what I decided to do was say, there's quite a bit of family history here. If you are interested, this is the file number, and this is how you can go about taking a look at it. But I had the strong impression that they weren't really interested, but it was a dilemma.
Mm. And, I think, we do come up against that, the so-called skeletons in the closet, and how are those ensuing generations happy to do that, but also your responsibility to tell the story and decide whether it's relevant to this book.
Well, it wasn't relevant. That level of detail is certainly not relevant.
Yeah.
But it is relevant to know about the women who lived there in the 1930s and their experience.
Yes, and it sounds like, and as it was elsewhere too, that story of mansions being, modified into flats and then providing a, respectable way for, a divorced woman to live, or a single woman to make their way. And were there any sort of silences or challenging parts of the story that you had to work extra hard to find that detail?
I'm just trying to think. I tend to go over absolutely every detail. In any bits of information that I receive, I go through every detail from various angles to try and discover information that may not be obvious. I think some people withheld information from me, which I understand. When they lived there, they weren't expecting someone to come along and write a book about them. And I quite accept that people tell fibs. That it was amazing. Some people came back and expanded their stories. They felt comfortable. They developed a sense of trust. So they told a lot more about what happened in the house. And some of the stories are quite sensitive because the house does have a history with drugs in the 60s and 70s. It didn't define the house, but it was there. And it didn't always turn out well for some people. So I guess I had to work out how far to go with some investigations, some research. But I do tend to keep everything. So, keep 100% and use maybe 20%. acknowledging that you are dealing with people's lives, and anything you publish has consequences.
Yeah, absolutely, that respect of all of those things. And I think, like you've said, you know, it is about a building, it's about a place, but it's so importantly about people. And I think that's what we all recognise when we read the book as well, those lives of people. And I think you've gone to great detail, but also told their stories in a really accessible way for everyone to read too. I'm really intrigued too, there were a lot of children, you know, at a certain point who were living there, and their memories and how, you know, their memories of their childhood versus telling you those stories in more recent years as adults. How did you approach dealing with children's memories?
Well, the children were very important to the research. Talking to adults about their childhood, they tell wonderful stories about playing, for example, you know, climbing around all the motifs around the house, the concrete lions' heads and, you know, Hera and Zeus, you know, so you get these wonderful stories. The children also went to places in the house that adults wouldn't. You know, adults tend to be more respectful. If they're told not to go up the tower, they don't, whereas children will try and find a way of getting in there. And they knew a lot more about the building than the adults. Also, they talked to other adults. You know, they didn't keep to themselves. They would just talk to anybody outside. And the adults would also talk to them. So you get a lot of information from children, people who were children at the time. On the other hand, you have to be very careful about their judgments of other people. So there was one man who told me about one of the tenants who was there when he was living there as a child, that he was a bit shady and that he was running a spy network. And I thought, okay, well, that could be true. But it didn't really fit in with what the other adults, who were adults at the time, were saying about this person. So children, yes, very valuable resource, but also you have to see that they've got a limit to their understanding of what's going on around them.
Mm. Oh, it's just also intriguing. And I thought that intergenerational friendships you talked about, particularly post-war, those sort of connections that perhaps because they were children, they were able to make in a really sort of, they were engaging with other people, perhaps more than adults might have.
Well, yes, and also a lot of the children who lived there in the 50s and early 60s didn't have grandparents. They'd either been killed in the war or they'd left them behind in Europe. And so there were a number of adults at the house who became de facto grandparents.
Oh, that's really lovely. And I, following on from that, there's a question here from an audience member who wants to know, is there more information about Holocaust survivors who stayed in the property in that period?
Yes, there are, well, there is a chapter, several chapters talking about the Holocaust survivors. And of course I have my own research, and there has been some information published in Labassa Lives, which is a journal I publish 3 times a year, and it's available on the National Trust website. Yes, I'm not sure how much information the person's looking for.
It sounds like the book is the way to go to read a little bit more about it. But I do encourage you to also look at the Labassa Lives journal. It's a really sort of a deep dive into different stories, and it's really really helps flesh out the story of Labassa. And we've got quite a few questions coming in our last few minutes of this conversation. And people said, someone asked, I believe that someone once lived under the stairs. Is this true to your knowledge?
Yes, it is true, but it was one of those situations where there was a bit of confusion about which stairs. So initially I thought it was the stairs, the main staircase, but it turned out to be another staircase at the back of the house. And I only found that out in recent years, when the person who lived under the stairs actually came to the house and was able to show me where he was living.
Oh, fabulous. It definitely sounds like, for anyone who hasn't visited Labassa, that a visit will help sort of, perhaps it might give you more questions, but it certainly feels like we'll be able to really feel the stories that Vicki's sharing with us today. Someone asks, was John Michaelhausen a tenant?
John Michaelhausen wasn't a tenant, but he was a visitor. And he used to go to one of the parties in the house, Peter Homewood's parties, because he worked with Peter Homewood, who worked on the Magic Circle Club at the time. He was an actor and producer. And I believe John Michaelhausen also worked with Peter Homewood on other productions. But John Michaelhausen sent me a wonderful piece very early on, probably about 2013, of a party he attended there. And that was a really important piece of research that he provided to me.
Oh, wonderful. And you've put so many pieces of the puzzle together into this beautiful book. There's another question here. Does Labassa have a water well on the property?
I believe there is a well in the rear, off the rear courtyard, at the back of the house. But it's been sealed for many years. I don't really know very much about it.
And I suppose, as one of our final questions, is to ask you, I know you've had a really long history with Labassa, and what was it that made you get involved in the first place?
Well, I actually lived close to Labassa in the 1970s. I was working in the area, and I would drive down Orong Road to and from work, and I would see this tower, and I would drive into Manor Grove. This is about 1974, and I would sit in my car and look, because I was just absolutely amazed that not only at this fantastic house, but that it was sitting behind a double brick venereal. I couldn't see it properly. And I used to see the people on the veranda, hippies, and I was just quite taken by it. I found out later I wasn't the only person who did that. It was quite common for tenants to come back and sit in their cars in the street or just walk around the grounds.
I mean, it is so striking, and I love that idea of you being entranced by the tower and then looking at it. And then what was it that made you, do the Labassa Lives journal and then eventually write this book?
Well, I think it's a big story. It is a very big story that hasn't been told comprehensively. Parts of it have been told and told very well, but to get an overview of why this house survived, it really needed a bit more. And also there are so many layers to the house. You've got the architecture, you've got the big question of why it survived, and you've got such a diversity of people who live there, from rich colonials through to hippies. And it's a big story. And also there were false narratives about the house. For example, in the 30s, that it was a DOS house that had been used by derelicts. I think people looked at the house and thought, what's the story here? And in the 60s and 70s, the young people were blamed for the condition of the house, which was really unfair, considering a lot of the condition of the house was due to water getting in and a lack of maintenance. So I thought it was important, to tell those stories and put them in perspective.
Wonderful. Vicki, thank you so much. I think we're all really glad that you've been able to put all of your knowledge and meticulous research all into one place. I'm going to share my screen for one last time. So we wanted to acknowledge the photographers whose photos we've used today in our in the presentation, and you can see their names there, some of which Vicki was able to tell us a little bit more about. And finally, perhaps today's talk might have got you thinking. Perhaps you're curious about Labassa itself, or perhaps you're a resident and would like to share your story. So Vicki has graciously shared her email address with us and welcomes you getting in touch that way. You can see on your screen the link to the Labassa Lives Journal. And if you'd like to buy the book, which I recommend, of course, once Labassa goes back to being able to have open days, you can buy it there, or even at Ripponlea or Como, as well as online. You can buy it from the National Trust shop, and lots of local bookstores certainly have it, like the Avenue or Ben's Books, or some of the other ones. And of course, restrictions permitting, at this stage, Labassa's next open day is scheduled for Sunday, September 19. But Vicki, do you have anything to say about the next visit options for people?
The only thing I can say is keep an eye on the National Trust website, because I think all Victorians in particular know that it's week by week.
Yes.
And that applies also to the Dollhouse
Yes.
exhibition. Just go to the website and check what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely wonderful. So thank you, Vicki, so much for sharing these stories with everyone and for your dedication to researching the many lives of Labassa. Our thanks go to the team behind the scenes, and finally, thanks to all of you for joining us today. Goodbye.
Thank you.